Om, Om, Om. Om, Om Tat Sat. Om, Satyanandam. Om, Paravak Shakti. Om, bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om, God directly speaking to God about God. Om. The 15th live stream teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Om. Absolute freedom of speech. Lssv 15. Om. Om, some meta information, the LSSVs. There's a tendency, Om, to not employ large, complex words and complicated concepts. Om, this is to keep the God information simple and easy to absorb for clarity. Om. Also, the speed of delivery varies dependent upon the information being revealed and the power of how it is revealed. So there is speeding up of delivery or slowing down of delivery, and then that is all within God's silence, which is all pervasive. Om. The following is not a contradictory teaching, but a comprehensive, complementary, all-inclusive introductory teaching to the speaking of about speech and freedom of speech, how speech is manifested. So, Om, to make this very clear, SATYAVEDISM upholds and advocates for complete freedom of speech. Om. All speech is in fact God's speech, because God alone exists. All speech emanates from God. God manifests the ability to speak. God manifests sounds. God manifests sounds and speech in all seeming species. God in the form of, for example, God in the form of birds. Melodic speaking or sound or music or various ways in which communication can be uttered. Om. So God in the happening of speech is actually a divine gift of God and is God. So there are various forms of speech. There is God truth speech, which is the highest form and happening of speech. Divine speech, speech that emanates directly from God. As God. Direct knowledge of God, speaking of God, as God. And then there are indirect ways of speaking that are also God's speech. There is God information that is conveyed through science and various technical information. And that is sort of an neither direct nor indirect necessarily, but somewhere in between. Because direct revelations can come from scientific information, mathematical information, etc. But the uttering of that information might not necessarily be felt as God direct. And then there is indirect God speech, which seemingly can be mundane, although in God reality nothing is mundane. It is all divine. And this is not a contradiction. But the indirect speech, it can be occluded by ignorance, otherwise known as fiction and relativity. Oh, so all free speech is God revealing what actually needs evolutioning. And therefore it is all important. And all God information that is conveyed through that manifest speech is important because it gives information as to, again, how God evolutioning needs to occur. So whether it is expressed outwardly, seemingly, or inwardly and not expressed outwardly, so that seeming others, God in the form of, can actually hear and understand that information. It is still manifesting, nevertheless, in one way or another. It is better that it is expressed seemingly outwardly. Oh, now for self-realization and God-realization purposes, the the following information is being given. And then further, for overall information purposes as regards to freedom of speech, other information is to be given. So firstly, is the information that pertains to God realization. So after hearing about truth, God truth, and starting to absorb that information in God consciousness, if there is God willingness, there begins a process of clearing of ignorance and fiction. So that presents itself as the awareness of the pointing to God's silence. So after having gone through and having absorbed all of this endless God information, primarily in the form of fiction, there is starting to a quieting of all of that noise. When there's a God willingness to realize God truth. So what happens is there's a limitation of the ingestion, the continued ingestion of a lot of that information. Eventually, all of that information is still free form, free flowing, activity in God, and there is no true isolation, again. But seemingly, there is a limitation of ingestion of that information in order to point to God's silence, in order to begin to realize that, which one is. And there are also non-engagement guidelines. More of this information is to become revealed and manifest in the teachings. But nevertheless, there is a form of what would be called pratyahara, which is to start to withdraw from the senses, etc., from the ingestion or the full-on ingestion of all the information that is usually absorbed. And of course, this is not imposed. And this is a natural process, actually. It should be. So it seemingly is a temporary withdrawal from that information in order to investigate what is underneath it all. So in that regard, it is not a censorship of that information. It is a withdrawal from that information to eventually see that information entirely in a different way. To transform that information into entirely something else. So it seemingly is a process. Of course, you are already God and always will be. And this is the God truth. But as long as that is not felt, this process takes place. Oh, now as for within fiction, seemingly itself, the teachings are that there should be absolute freedom of speech. And this includes the propagation of the teachings and God in the form of the teachings. So whatever terminology that would be, freedom of speech, freedom of God expression, freedom of information. God information is free. And it disseminates out, God willing, exactly the way it is supposed to, always, as all activities manifest. So whether that be expressed as freedom of religion, freedom of spirituality, freedom of whatever, it is still freedom of speech in a sense, freedom of God information. And God information is all information. So within seeming fiction, SATYAVEDISm upholds absolute freedom of speech. There should be overstanding of all seeming perspectives within no perspective. Now, no perspective is God absolute. And there are seeming multifarious perspectives, endless perspectives within. So all these various seeming perspectives manifest as God. When there is God realization, all of those perspectives are God myself. But there is no judgment and no holding on to any particular perspective. There's no identifying with any particular perspective. There's no perspective and all perspectives. But the no perspective is the transcendent perspective, which is not a perspective. So all the perspectives manifest. So within the relativity, there seems to be the search for what is true and what is not true. And there's endless back and forth and seemingly conflicting, debating, argumentation, etc. Or just the exploration to try to determine what an actual true perspective would be. So sometimes that manifests as antagonistic, and other times it manifests as cooperative, which is a seeming better scenario toward truth. And this is God evolutioning within fiction. That's that seeming search for the debating that might actually lead to God truth. And that's God manifesting. It's that way toward truth. So within that, if there isn't completely wanting to transcend all of that, which is the direct way, then within that, as all of that manifesting is occurring, and all the exchanging of perspectives, etc., it is best to try to to overstand as many perspectives as possible and not to rest on any one. Because the more perspectives that are overstood, the wider the God information becomes. And this will lead out of many biases and many constricted thought patternings. That lead to all sorts of unnecessary behaviorings that cause conflict and unhappiness, etc. So it is best to have as broad an understanding of perspectives as possible, and then to break out through that. So the dropping of any particular perspective is part of the deconstruction. So it's best to understand as many perspectives as possible. So in God and the Happening of such an area is called philosophy, there's terminology for that. Although the terminology is faulty and is gender-based for some reason. So one of the ways of speaking about it is perspectivism. There is terminology called steel man or strong man. And then there is straw man. So straw man is taking a seeming oppositional stance and basically distilling it and distorting it in order to present an alternative argument and then champion that. So it is not even a seemingly rationally sound way of approaching truth. And then there is, a straw man or whatever. It could be straw person, but then there are no persons. So it is best just to simply explain what that phenomenon is. So the terminology is deficient. And then there is, again, steel man or strong man or whatever. So throw the terminology away. What it's pointing to is that you take a supposed argument of a seeming oppositional character and make it even stronger than it is being presented, then in order to speak of it or to counter it. So regardless of label, what it is pointing to is the better way of understanding perspective, which is to actually overstand it so much that it is absorbed, it has been absorbed and assimilated well enough in order to be able to re-express it in a better way. So with all the conflict and debate and all the argumentation that usually takes place in fiction, the former way of understanding another perspective is usually used instead of the latter. The former rejects it before really understanding it because it wants to create, again, this is pseudo-egoing. So it wants to present its seeming perspective in order to have some satisfaction from it, and not to understand a seeming other perspective. Whereas the latter absorbs the perspective so well, and other perspectives. So if there is wanting to understand and widen and widen and widen and keep widening the many perspectives, it is vastly better to go to use the second technique, the latter technique, than the former, which is very biased usually. And there is not enough of that in what is called even conflict and argumentation and debate, etc. But the even better way is to transcend it all. And in the transcension, all the perspectives are still available within God consciousness. And all to be seen and understood. And that by far is the transcendence to God reality, where all of that God information becomes transformed. God information that is readily available and is all myself, God myself. So, in God, absolute freedom of speech, which is all inclusive of all speech. There should be no oppression and no seeming incarceration and seeming censorship that comes from the free expression, from the natural flow of that information. It should not be impeded. It leads to repression and all seeming, even bodily, God in the form of bodily illnesses when it is oppressed and constricted. Now, some of this information even if it is what is called hateful, or what is deemed or judged as inciting, possibly inciting violence, and SATYAVEDISM does not condone violence. It asserts nonviolence, in fact. And it also asserts that that's inclusive of what is termed psychic violence. That is, words that can lead to seeming injury if, and this is the key, if the words are believed. Because the words are not what seemingly injures. It is the belief in words. So let that be clear. But in seeming relativity, such seeming hate speech or seemingly inciting of violence speech, it is better that it is known. It is better that it comes out seemingly and that it is heard. It is better that it is known than that it is seemingly secretive. And there is no privacy in God anyway, but seemingly what would be called secretive. It is better that all of that information is known, because it points to the evolution that needs to occur. God evolution. All of this information is useful in that way. It points to a seeming misery. It points to unhappiness. It points to that information so that it can be resolved. So it is important to know when there is suffering of that way. Because hate is actual suffering. Violence is from suffering. So instead of seeming hating the hater or ostracizing the hater or etc., or banning the hater, the seeming called hater, etc., it is better to understand the perspective and then to overstand the perspective, to understand, understand, and overstand those perspectives. In order to lead to God transcension. It is not about rejection. It is about education. So these seeming perspectives that are manifest, it is better if they are manifest overtly, seemingly in fiction. Now, the words do not lead to the physical violence itself that sometimes manifests. The words are not that violence that occurs. Now, it is best if that violence diminish and cease. And this is a major teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Nonviolence and its end. The violence is not to end by seemingly suppressing hateful speech. Violence is to end when reality is understood, understood, and overstood. When it is cured. And yes, violence can be cured. But all the various perspectives of seeming unhappiness have to become manifest and overstood, actually overtly have to be expressed. Because it is a calling out for assistance, for help. However it sounds, if it sounds aggressive, etc., if it sounds combative, etc., it is still, with God vision, it is seen as asking for help. It is convoluted, but nevertheless, it is a cry for help, assistance. So these words must be known. Whatever the words sound, whatever the sound is. But ultimately, the goal is to alleviate and diminish hate and violence, and then to cease it. That is the God transcension, one of the many aspects. So in the self-realization and God-realization techniques, all of this information and fictioning is available and proliferates extensively everywhere in God infinity. Oh. So in terms of the actual process seemingly toward realization, however, it is best to start to discern, to investigate the actual language itself. And the teachings, there are teachings, Lssv teachings and SSSV teachings, etc., that expound upon this, and there are to be other teachings as well. They go into the language investigation. And how to use language. So ideally, language in the God transcension is to be used divinely, because the gift of language, that is God, is divine. So it is how God, the language, is to become the highest manifestation, the highest usage of language. But the language is a reflection of God consciousness. So the investigation of language and through the meditation techniques and the various ways of witnessing language, it calls attention to how it is used. And it calls attention to the ways in which there needs to be God assistance. It becomes very clear and obvious what that free speech is expressing. So that free speech needs to continue to be free and not repressed. Even within the investigation toward God realization, it is pointing to what needs to be more clear. So when there is investigation and witnessing, seemingly of thoughts within or thoughts emanating, there's no inner, there's no outer, etc., but what feels like thoughts within or whatever, that each thought is it is God information about what needs to be cleared. It's actually very helpful, useful information. This is exactly the information that is needed, exactly when it is manifest, exactly as it is witnessed. It is, in a sense, instantaneous feedback. So it should be used as such. So the various techniques of how to watch those thoughts and then either to discard the thoughts or to go into the thoughts, etc. That information has been given, and more information is to be given. But the thoughts are very helpful. So in practicing, with all the free speech that is occurring, it should continue to occur. But when there is investigating and pointing, there's the God willing toward realizing the God consciousness and realizing then God manifestation and God absolute. There is the need to withdraw from, again, from various information in order to point to the God consciousness and God silence, etc. So the ingestion of all sorts of information starts to be, in a sense, restricted, seemingly temporarily. So with all the conflicts and argumentations and debates, etc., there are also non-engagement guidelines of SATYAVEDISM as to not to go into fiction and create more fiction. So it is about the non-engagement with that fiction in order to have more and more and more clarity, to clear and clear and clear all of what seems to be obfuscation, seems to be opaqueness or pollution, etc., seems to be seemingly in the way of the clarity of God vision. So there's the non-engagement of engaging in conflictive debate and behaviors, etc., that just can lead to more and more and more of that. And of course, other fictional information as well. And even when there is non-engagement, if there can sometimes is expression, if the seeming words come out anyway, it might be felt as that there is a conflict or a debate or an argument going on, seemingly in a seeming other, all God, myself. And then the projectioning that there is an argument taking place when there is not. Because there can be no argument taking place if only seeming one is arguing. But that may feel like that. But it is all the words that are being expressed is in God whole consciousness. So there is no separation of these words seemingly arguing with these words, etc. There isn't no actual separation of the words. The words are all appearing in consciousness, regardless of where the words seem to be appearing from. That is not real. It is all appearing in God consciousness. So that is why there is no actual isolation from seeming words. And the actual words that seem to be occurring that have not emanated, those thoughts are actually available and not private, etc. They're all within God consciousness. All is accessible. God Omni, Om. But while there is seemingly the feeling that there is an attempt at God realization, that it is best to use the God information of words as best as possible toward that realization, but while pointing toward the God silence primarily. Another point of freedom of speech within fiction, Om. So all God information is not private. There is no privacy in God. But within the fiction, there seems to be privacy. So there are various platforms, seemingly God and the happening of, where various speech takes place, all sorts of venues, and in all seeming categories of fiction, perhaps seeming what is called politics or God in the form of social platforms, etc. All where there is plenty of speech bounding about. So there is emphasizing of absolute freedom of speech. Although on some of these various platforms that seemingly are rather public, there are various restrictions and censorships and all taking place seemingly because in fact, in fiction, these platforms are actually what is called privately owned, what is called companies, etc. So they're not actually what is called in fiction public utilities, quote unquote. So there is debate going on about that, about whether how much freedom of expression there can be on seeming platforms where there is such a widespread activity and expression, yet in what is called legal terms, it is not public, or it is not actually like public domain, public utility, public, actual public forum. And not the lines of what would be considered politics or actual rights, etc. Blur. So there are seemingly cries about censorship and all sorts of argumentation, etc., and conflict about what is appropriate and what is not, and what information is actually fact and what information is actually fiction. When most of it is species fiction anyway. But nevertheless, it is still God information. It is God expressing itself in many, many multifarious ways, endlessly. Whether it is direct or not, and whether the usage of the wording is divine or seemingly not. Whether it is seemingly ignorance-based or not. It is all, in a sense, still valuable information toward God transcension. And in that way, it is very valuable. But it is best that it is overstood from a transcendent non-perspectivism. No perspective. When it all can be seen as God manifesting. And then there are also so many, many contexts that all of this expression is occurring within. So although there should be absolute freedom of speech, there are seemingly some circumstances where it would actually be funny or humorous. Like, for instance, the freedom of speech, in a sense, has to be in some way contextual. Like perhaps if a math teaching got in the form of a mathematics teaching was occurring, in a seeming mathematics class somewhere in infinity. And there was teaching occurring. And all of a sudden, there was some blurting out from the God in the form of the seeming student body about some information that had no apparent it had nothing to do whatsoever with the actual information that was being conveyed whatsoever. But there was adamancy that this information needed to be expressed at that very moment in eternity, or else it would be suppressing free speech. And then there was taking over of the class in order to express that speech. So that is a humorous example of how free speech in context might be well, it could be deemed inappropriate, but actually it might be humorous. It's an extreme example of free speech occurring without censorship. This must take place. This information has to be given, regardless of what the mathematics teaching is going on. So anyway, so the God in the form of free speech, perhaps context can be taken into account. But overall, in God, is God context, so it's all God manifesting, so the boundaries disappear. But that's in relativity, supposedly. So anyway, in God in general, there is extolling of Om, God absolute free speech. But Om, may the realization of the potentiality of the absolute free expression of speech in God transcension become God absolute divinity of God expression, God speech, God truth speech, the God transcension of God truth speech, where the speech is God's speech direct in God consciousness about the God divinity of God reality. Om, God manifest, activate, and so it is, and so it is to be. Om. Paravak Shakti. Om. Tat Sat.